The first sound I heard that Saturday morning was not my alarm, not the coffee maker, not birds on the fence like every other quiet weekend. It was metal teeth ripping through the ground behind my house. At first, I thought one of the construction crews from the new townhouse project had started early again. They had been doing that for weeks, shaking windows before breakfast and leaving dust on every car in the neighborhood. But when I pulled the curtain back, my stomach dropped. There was a mini excavator in my backyard. Not behind my backyard, not near the property line, in my backyard. Its bucket was tearing a trench straight through the grass I had spent years keeping alive. A section of my wooden fence was already lying flat on the ground. Two workers were dragging orange pipe across my lawn like they owned it. Beside the patio, the hydrangea bushes my late wife had planted were crushed into the mud. I ran outside barefoot, still in sweatpants, yelling for them to stop. The machine paused, but nobody looked shocked. Nobody looked sorry. A man in a hard hat walked toward me with a clipboard and the bored expression of someone who had already decided I did not matter. He told me the developer had permission to use this access path. He said the HOA had approved it. He said the trench was temporary, the damage was minor, and I needed to let them finish because the project schedule was tight. Then the developer himself pulled up in a black SUV, stepped out wearing sunglasses, and acted like I was the trespasser. He looked across my torn-up lawn and said my backyard sat inside a utility access area, and if I interfered, he would have the HOA fine me for delaying approved community improvements. I remember standing there, looking at the tire tracks across my grass, the broken fence, the mud collecting around my patio, and the bushes my wife had planted with her own hands. Something in me wanted to scream. Something in me wanted to block the excavator with my truck and make them fight me for every inch. But I did not. I took out my phone. I recorded the machine, the workers, the removed fence, the crushed landscaping, the company logos on the trucks, and the developer calmly telling me he had every right to be there. 3 weeks later, that same video would be playing inside the county permit office while an inspector compared it to the approved site plan. And by the time he finished reading the file, that million-dollar townhouse project was no longer moving forward. Before the excavator ever touched my yard, I was not the kind of person who fought with neighbors, contractors, or the HOA. I was the guy who waved from the driveway, kept my trash cans behind the fence, paid my dues on time, and read every notice twice because I never wanted problems. My house sat near the end of a quiet street in a suburban neighborhood that looked peaceful from the outside. 2-car garages, American flags on porches, kids riding bikes after school, retired couples walking dogs in the evening. It was not fancy, but it was the kind of place where people moved because they wanted stability. For me, that little house was more than real estate. It was the last big decision my wife and I made together. We bought it 12 years earlier, back when the paint was faded, the fence leaned a little, and the backyard looked like plain dirt with weeds. The realtor apologized for it, but my wife saw something I did not. She stood on the patio, looked across that empty space, and said it felt like a place where a family could finally breathe. So we made it ours. Every spring she planted something new. Hydrangeas near the patio, lavender along the fence, a young maple tree in the far corner where the afternoon sun came through just right. I built the raised garden beds badly the first time, then rebuilt them after she laughed at how crooked they were. Our daughter learned to ride her bike in slow circles across that grass, crashing into the same soft patch near the shed, over and over, until she finally made it all the way around without falling. After my wife passed, the house got quieter in a way I still do not know how to explain. The rooms were the same, the mortgage was the same, the HOA dues still arrived every quarter, but the silence had weight. Some mornings, the only thing that got me outside was the thought that her plants still needed water. That backyard became my routine. Coffee before work, a few minutes pulling weeds after dinner, Saturday mornings trimming the grass along the fence line. I was not trying to build a magazine-perfect yard. I was trying to preserve the one place that still felt connected to the life we had built. Behind my property, there used to be a wide, vacant lot. It had been empty for as long as I lived there, just a rough piece of land with tall grass, scrub trees, and a narrow service road that ran off the main street. Nobody paid much attention to it until a developer bought it and announced plans for a row of luxury townhouses. At first, I did not object. I understood that land changes hands. I understood that property owners have rights. I was not one of those people who believed nothing should ever be built near me. The developer owned that lot, and if the county approved the project, then he had the right to build on his own land. On his own land. That was the line that mattered to me. The first few weeks were annoying but manageable. Trucks rolled in early. Dust drifted over the fence. Workers parked along the curb. Sometimes I heard backup beepers before the approved construction hours, and once a cement truck blocked half the street while I was trying to leave for work. I complained once to the HOA management company, but the reply was polite and useless. They said the project would increase neighborhood value and asked residents to be patient during temporary inconvenience. Temporary inconvenience became the phrase everyone used when they wanted homeowners to stay quiet. The HOA board loved the project. At meetings, they called it progress. They said the new townhouses would modernize the community, raise property values, and attract the kind of buyers who cared about appearances. The developer attended one of those meetings in a tailored jacket and smiled like he already owned the room. He thanked the board for being forward-thinking, then talked about curb appeal, walkability, and long-term neighborhood improvement. Not once did he talk about the people already living there. That was when I first noticed how he looked at us. Not like neighbors, not like homeowners, more like obstacles that needed to be managed. I remember sitting in the back row of that HOA meeting, listening while the board president told everyone cooperation was expected. She said construction might require minor adjustments around the edges of nearby properties, but residents should trust that all work would be handled professionally. Something about that sentence bothered me. Minor adjustments to whose property? Around which edges? Approved by whom? I raised my hand and asked whether any work would cross private property lines. The room got quiet for half a second. The developer smiled and said everything would be done according to the approved plans. The HOA president nodded quickly and moved on to the next agenda item. It was not an answer. It was a performance. Still, I went home that night trying to convince myself I was overthinking it. Maybe grief had made me protective. Maybe the backyard meant so much to me that even normal construction felt like a threat. Maybe the developer really did have everything in order, so I kept living my life. I went to work, I watered the hydrangeas, I mowed along the fence, I ignored the trucks as best I could, but slowly, the construction pushed closer. A survey stake appeared near the back corner of my lot, then disappeared. Orange paint showed up on the ground behind my fence. A stack of drainage pipe was dropped near the vacant lot, facing my property instead of the service road. One evening, I found muddy boot prints just inside my gate, but I told myself a worker had probably leaned over by mistake. Then the HOA sent an email that changed the feeling in my stomach. It said certain rear property areas might be accessed for utility preparation related to the townhouse project. It did not include a map. It did not list addresses. It did not attach a county permit, a signed easement, or any agreement from affected homeowners. It simply thanked us for our cooperation and reminded us that community improvement required patience. I read that email 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I looked out the window at the backyard my wife had built with me, one plant at a time. That was the first moment I understood they were not asking permission. They were preparing us to accept whatever they had already decided. And if you have ever had an HOA, a developer, or a contractor talk over you like your own property is just an inconvenience to their plan, you already know that feeling. Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the only reason people learn how to protect themselves is because someone else tells the story first. The email from the HOA arrived on a Wednesday evening, right after dinner, while I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee mug for the next morning. The subject line looked harmless. Community Utility Preparation Notice. I opened it expecting another generic update about traffic cones, temporary noise, or construction vehicles near the back entrance. Instead, the message said certain rear property areas might be accessed for utility preparation connected to the townhouse development. It thanked homeowners for their cooperation, reminded us that the project had been reviewed by the board, and said temporary access was necessary to support long-term neighborhood improvement. There was no map, no list of affected homes, no county permit attached, no signed authorization from me or any other homeowner. Just a vague paragraph written in that soft corporate language people use when they want something serious to sound routine. I replied the same night. I asked which properties were affected, what access they were claiming, whether there was a recorded easement, and whether any work would cross private property lines. I kept the message polite. I even added that I was not trying to delay anything, but I needed clarification before anyone entered my property. Nobody answered. The next morning, I called the HOA management office and left a voicemail. No response. That afternoon, I sent a follow-up email. Still nothing. By Friday, I had convinced myself they would not actually touch my yard without talking to me first. I was wrong. Saturday morning, the excavator was already there. By the time I got outside, part of my fence had been removed so cleanly it was obvious this had not been an accident. Someone had unscrewed the panels, pulled 2 posts loose, and laid the pieces across the grass like they planned to put them back later and pretend nothing had happened. Muddy tracks ran from the vacant lot behind me, straight across my lawn. A trench had already been carved from the back corner toward the side of my patio, wider than my dining room table, and deep enough that rainwater was collecting at the bottom. 2 workers were guiding a long black drainage pipe into the hole. Another worker was stacking orange cones near my garden beds. A pallet of construction materials sat where my daughter's old swing set used to be. They had even placed a portable generator beside the maple tree my wife planted the year before she got sick. I told them to stop immediately. One of the workers shut off the generator, but the excavator kept idling. The man with the clipboard walked over and introduced himself as the site supervisor. He did not ask who I was. He did not apologize. He just said they were performing approved utility prep work and would be finished faster if I let them continue. I told him this was my property. He glanced behind him at the trench, then back at me, as if that detail was inconvenient but not important. He said the developer had an agreement with the HOA to use the rear access area. I told him the HOA could not give away my backyard. He shrugged and said I would have to take that up with the board. That was when the developer arrived. I had seen him before at the HOA meeting, smiling under bright fluorescent lights while he talked about increasing property values. In my backyard, he looked different, less polished, more irritated. He stepped out of his black SUV, walked around the trench like he was inspecting his own job site, and asked why the crew had stopped. I told him they were trespassing. He laughed once, not loudly, but enough to make every worker look away. Then he told me my backyard was part of a utility access zone. He said the project had already been approved. He said the HOA was fully aware of the work. He said these things happened during development, and homeowners who understood how communities improved did not make a scene over temporary dirt. Temporary dirt. That was what he called my torn-up yard. I pointed at the broken fence, the crushed hydrangeas, the trench full of muddy water, and the pipe lying across my lawn. I asked him to show me the easement that allowed him to be there. He did not show me anything. He just repeated that the HOA had approved access and told me the county had already reviewed the project. I asked for the permit number. His face changed for half a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice maybe, but I saw it. The calm smile tightened. His jaw moved. Then he said, permits were not something I needed to worry about because I was not the applicant. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. A person with legal permission usually shows the paper. A person without it tells you the paper is none of your business. I told him again to remove his crew from my property. He stepped closer, lowered his voice, and said I needed to be careful. He said delaying active construction could make me liable for costs. He said if his schedule slipped because of me, his attorney would know exactly where to send the bill. Then he added that the HOA could fine me for interfering with approved community improvements. A few minutes later, the HOA board president arrived. I do not know who called her, maybe the developer, maybe the supervisor, but she came through my side gate wearing tennis shoes and carrying her phone like she had been waiting for this exact moment. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not look at the damage. She went straight to the developer, spoke with him quietly, then turned to me with the same disappointed expression she used at meetings when someone complained about parking. She said the board had been briefed on the need for utility access. She said the project benefited the entire neighborhood. She said I was escalating a temporary inconvenience into an unnecessary conflict. I asked her if the HOA had signed something giving the developer permission to enter my property. She said the HOA had authority over common interest community improvements. I asked if my backyard was common property. She did not answer that. Instead, she told me cooperation was expected under the governing documents and warned me that continued obstruction could result in enforcement action. That was HOA language for fines, letters, hearings, and threats, dressed up as procedure. The developer looked satisfied. He folded his arms and said, "See? This is not just about you. This is about the community." That sentence hit harder than I expected, because it was exactly how people like him took from ordinary homeowners. They did not say they were taking your land. They said you were being selfish. They did not say they were ignoring your rights. They said you were standing in the way of progress. I asked one final time for the work to stop until legal access could be proven. The developer turned to the supervisor and told him to continue. The excavator bucket dropped back into the earth. I remember the sound more than anything, the crunch of roots, the wet scrape of dirt, the engine shaking through my patio. I stood there with my phone in my hand while the HOA president told me to calm down, and the developer acted like my property line was a suggestion. By noon, the trench stretched across almost the entire rear section of my yard. They had cut through 2 sprinkler lines, leaving water bubbling up under the sod. They had dragged pipe over one of the garden beds, snapping the wooden frame in half. They parked a small skid steer close enough to my patio that black tire marks smeared the concrete. I called the non-emergency sheriff's line. A deputy came out about 40 minutes later. By then, the developer had switched personalities. He was calm, polite, almost charming. He told the deputy there was a misunderstanding about utility access and said the HOA had authorized the work. The HOA president nodded beside him as if that settled everything. The deputy asked if I had paperwork showing they were not allowed there. I almost laughed, but not because it was funny. I was standing in my own backyard, next to my own broken fence, being asked to prove strangers did not have permission to dig through my land. I showed him my driver's license with the address. I showed him the deed folder I had rushed inside to grab, though it was an old closing copy and not something a deputy could interpret on the spot. The deputy took notes, told everyone this looked like a civil property dispute, and said I should contact the county and possibly an attorney. The developer heard that and smiled again. To him, civil dispute meant keep working. It meant no handcuffs, no immediate order, no one physically forcing him out. He turned back to me and said, "You heard the officer. This is not criminal. Let the professionals handle it." Then he walked away before I could answer. That afternoon, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain came down fast, the kind that turns loose dirt into soup within minutes. The trench filled almost immediately. Mud spilled over the edges and flowed toward my patio. Brown water ran across the concrete, under the outdoor furniture, and toward the back door. The broken sprinkler line kept feeding the mess from underneath. I called the site supervisor and told him their trench was flooding my patio. He said rain was an act of God. I emailed the HOA president with photos of the water, the mud, the removed fence, and the damaged plants. She replied 2 hours later with one sentence: "Please direct all construction-related concerns to the developer's representative." The developer's representative did not respond. By Sunday morning, my backyard looked like a construction accident nobody wanted to claim. The hydrangeas were flattened. The lavender was buried. The maple tree had mud piled against its trunk. My fence had a hole wide enough for anyone to walk through, and orange construction fencing had been loosely tied across it like that somehow made it secure. On Monday, I received a formal HOA violation notice. Not an apology, not a repair schedule, a violation notice. It said my rear yard was in an unsightly condition visible from adjacent property, and that I had failed to maintain fencing standards. It also said the board had received reports that I was interfering with approved community work, and any continued obstruction could result in fines after a hearing. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter until the words stopped looking real. They had entered my property without showing permission. They had removed my fence. They had dug a trench through my yard. They had damaged my landscaping, broken my irrigation, flooded my patio, and then the HOA blamed me for the mess they created. That was when my anger changed. Before that letter, I was angry in the normal way. Hot, loud, immediate. The kind of anger that makes you want to stand in the yard and shout until someone finally admits what they did. After that letter, my anger got quiet, because I understood something important. They were not confused. They were not making a mistake. The developer was counting on money and pressure. The HOA was counting on fear and paperwork. They both believed I would get tired, overwhelmed, or intimidated enough to let it go. So I stopped arguing. I stopped calling people who would not answer. I stopped asking the developer to respect a boundary he had already decided did not matter. Instead, I opened a folder on my computer and named it Backyard Trespass. I dragged in every email, every photo, every video, every voicemail, every notice, every timestamp, and every name I could document. They had turned my yard into a construction route. Now I was going to turn their confidence into evidence. The first thing I did was stop talking to people who had already shown me they were not listening. That sounds simple, but when you are standing in a damaged backyard with mud on your patio and a violation letter on your kitchen table, every part of you wants to call someone and demand an answer. You want to hear one person say it was wrong. You want the HOA president to admit she overstepped. You want the developer to pick up the phone and say his crew made a mistake. But people like that do not usually give you truth over the phone. They give you confusion. They give you half sentences. They give you denials that disappear later, because nothing was written down. So I made a rule for myself that morning. From that point forward, everything had to be documented. I took my phone outside and started recording slowly, not angrily, not shaking the camera around, just moving inch by inch through the yard like I was building a file for someone who had never seen my house before. I recorded the hole in the fence where the panels had been removed. I recorded the muddy tire tracks coming from the developer's lot. I recorded the trench cutting across my grass, the drainage pipe inside it, the broken sprinkler heads, the crushed garden bed, the mud against the maple tree, and the place where the hydrangeas had been flattened into the ground. Then I stepped back and recorded the whole yard from the patio, so there was no question where the damage was located. After that, I took still photos from every angle, wide shots, close-ups, photos with my house visible in the background, photos with the vacant lot visible beyond the fence, photos of the orange construction fencing they had tied across my property like a cheap apology. I even took pictures of the footprints near my side gate and the scrape marks on the fence posts where the screws had been pulled. Inside, I created a folder on my computer and named it Backyard Trespass. Then I created subfolders the way my attorney later told me most homeowners should. Emails, photos, videos, HOA notices, permits, property records, contractor information, and timeline. At that point, I did not have an attorney yet. I just knew that if this ever reached one, I did not want to show up with a story. I wanted to show up with proof. I downloaded every HOA email related to the townhouse project, not just the recent one. All of them. The meeting announcements, the construction updates, the notice about utility preparation, the message praising the developer for improving the neighborhood, the warning about resident cooperation. I saved them as PDFs so nobody could claim the wording had changed later. Then I searched my inbox for the developer's company name and saved those messages too. Next, I wrote down a timeline from memory while everything was still fresh. Wednesday evening, HOA utility notice received. Wednesday night, clarification requested. Thursday morning, voicemail left with HOA management. Friday afternoon, no response. Saturday morning, fence removed and excavator inside backyard. Saturday afternoon, sheriff's deputy responded. Saturday night, rain caused trench flooding. Monday morning, HOA violation notice received. I wrote every detail I could remember, including what the developer said. The part about the HOA approving access. The part about my yard being a utility access area. The part where he said permits were not something I needed to worry about. The part where the HOA president refused to say my backyard was common property, but still warned me about enforcement action. I did not exaggerate. I did not add insults. I did not write what I wished I had said. I wrote what happened. Then I checked the cameras. I had 2 security cameras on the back of the house. One pointed toward the patio. The other covered part of the yard and the gate. I installed them years earlier after a package theft, never imagining they would become the most important witnesses I had. The footage from Saturday morning made my hands go cold. At 6:42 a.m., 2 workers entered through the rear side of the fence from the developer's lot. At 6:47, one of them began unscrewing the fence panel. At 6:55, the panel came down. At 7:08, The mini excavator rolled through the opening and into my yard. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody called me. Nobody left a notice. Nobody waited for permission. I exported the clips immediately. Then I watched the footage from Friday evening. That was when I saw something I had missed. A man in a reflective vest walked up to the fence line with the site supervisor. They pointed toward my patio, looked around, and took pictures over the fence. They knew exactly where they were going before they entered. This was not a crew that accidentally crossed a line by a few feet. This was planned. I saved those clips too. After that, I pulled out the folder from when my wife and I bought the house. It had been sitting in a file cabinet for years, full of closing documents I never thought I would need again. Deed title insurance paperwork, old survey, HOA disclosure packet, plat map, mortgage documents. Everything still smelled faintly like paper and dust. I spread it all across the dining room table. The survey from closing showed my lot clearly. The rear property line was marked. There was a small utility easement along one back corner, narrow and close to the edge of the property. I remembered the title company mentioning it when we bought the house. It was for utility access, not construction access, and it did not run through the middle of my yard. But the trench outside did. The more I looked at that old survey, the more the developer's words bothered me. He had said my backyard sat inside a utility access area. That was not what my survey showed. Maybe there was a newer recorded easement I did not know about. Maybe something changed when the vacant lot was sold. I did not want to assume. I needed the official records, so I called the county clerk's office. The first person transferred me to land records. Land records transferred me to the permit office. The permit office told me some records could be accessed online, but construction plans for active developments might require a public records request. I wrote down every department, every phone number, and every name. By lunch, I had submitted a request for the developer's approved site plan, drainage plan, construction access plan, grading permit, stormwater documents, and any recorded easement affecting my parcel. Then I searched the county property database myself. I pulled up my parcel number. I pulled up the developer's parcel. I downloaded the plat map and compared it to my closing survey. The lines matched more closely than I expected. My backyard did not magically become community access. It was still my lot. That afternoon, I called a licensed surveyor. The first company was booked for 3 weeks. The second said they could come out the following Thursday. The third had a cancellation and agreed to come the next morning when I explained that active construction had crossed onto my property. I told them I needed more than a casual look. I needed a boundary survey, marked corners, written findings, and documentation I could give to an attorney or county inspector. The surveyor arrived at 8 a.m. with equipment I did not understand and a calmness I desperately needed. He did not care what the developer said. He did not care what the HOA claimed. He cared about recorded documents, physical markers, measurements, and the legal description of the parcel. He found the old iron pins. He checked coordinates. He measured from the street, from the side boundary, from the rear line. He compared the county plat to my deed and the old survey from closing. Every time he placed a flag, I felt the story getting less emotional and more dangerous for the developer, because the flags did not help them. One orange flag landed near the broken fence post. Another landed behind the trench. Another showed that the line the developer seemed to be using was not my property line at all. By the time the surveyor finished, he told me he still needed to prepare the report, but his preliminary measurement showed the trench was well inside my property, not inches, not a harmless mistake, several feet in some places, and much more near the patio side. I asked him if the HOA could authorize that. He looked at me for a second and said, "Not unless they own your yard." That sentence did more for me than any angry phone call could have. When the official survey report came 2 days later, it was even worse for the developer. The trench crossed my property line and ran approximately 18 feet into my lot at its deepest point. The removed fence had been placed correctly according to the boundary markers. The so-called rear access area did not match any easement shown on my deed or the recorded plat. I sent the report to the attorney I had contacted the day before. Finding an attorney was its own strange lesson. Some firms did not handle property disputes unless there was a sale involved. Some wanted a large retainer just to review the case. One office told me this sounded like an HOA issue. Another told me it sounded like a construction trespass issue. Finally, I found a property attorney who asked the right first question. She did not ask how angry I was. She asked what proof I had. I sent her the survey, the video clips, the HOA emails, the violation notice, photos of the yard, the deputy's incident number, and the timeline. She called me back later that afternoon and said the same thing I had started to believe but was afraid to say out loud. This was not just a misunderstanding. She said there were several possible issues: trespass, property damage, improper construction access, drainage interference, possible permit violations, and HOA overreach. But she also gave me one warning very clearly. I was not to block equipment, threaten workers, remove pipe, fill the trench myself, or get into another shouting match in the yard. Anything I did impulsively could be used to make me look unreasonable. The goal was not to win the argument in the moment. The goal was to build a record so strong that they could not talk their way around it. She drafted a demand letter. It required the developer to stop all activity on my property, remove equipment and materials, preserve all communications related to the decision to enter my yard, provide any claimed easement or access agreement, notify their insurance carrier, and arrange restoration of my property. It also put the HOA on notice that it had no authority to grant access to privately owned land unless such authority existed in the recorded governing documents. That last line mattered, because while I waited for the county records, I started reading the HOA bylaws and covenants myself. I am not going to pretend I enjoyed it. The language was dry, circular, and clearly written by people who believed using 5 words was suspicious when 30 would do. But I read every page anyway. The HOA could enforce architectural standards. It could regulate fences, exterior paint, landscaping visibility, parking rules, and common area use. It could approve improvements. It could fine owners after notice and hearing. But I could not find a single clause giving the board the power to hand a homeowner's backyard to a private developer for construction access. The closest language involved utility easements and maintenance rights, but those applied to recorded easements and association-owned common areas. My yard was neither. The developer's project was not an HOA utility repair, it was a private construction project for profit. I highlighted every relevant section. Then I did one more thing. I checked the developer's permit documents online again, late that night, searching by company name, parcel number, and project address. Some records had started appearing in the public portal. The grading permit was listed, the stormwater review was listed, the site plan approval was listed. But I noticed something strange. The construction access route in the uploaded plan did not appear to come through my yard. It came from the service road on the developer's parcel. I zoomed in until the lines blurred. I downloaded the file and opened it on my desktop. The approved route was narrow, inconvenient, and probably expensive to work around, but it was there. It stayed within the developer's property. The drainage path also stayed within the developer's property. The trench in my yard was not on that drawing, not even close. I sat there in the blue light of the computer screen with the first real sense of control I had felt since the excavator arrived. For days, the developer had made me feel like I was standing in the way of some official process too large for me to question. The HOA had acted like permission existed somewhere above my head, in a room I was not allowed to enter. But the documents were saying something different. The documents were saying they had a plan, and then they ignored it. The next morning, I sent the approved site plan, the survey report, and the camera footage to the county permit office with a formal complaint. I kept the message factual. I included dates, times, parcel numbers, and the permit number. I stated that active construction appeared to be occurring outside the approved limits of disturbance and on private property not owned by the applicant. I attached photos showing the trench, the fence removal, and the pipe location. No insults, no threats, no dramatic language, just evidence. Then I copied my attorney. For the first time, I did not feel like a homeowner begging powerful people to be decent. I felt like someone who had stopped playing by their rules and started using the only language they could not ignore: paper, video, survey markers, permit records. By the end of that week, the developer had stopped sending smug messages through the HOA. The board president stopped answering casual questions with vague phrases about community improvement. Even the site supervisor, who had once acted like my yard was just another work zone, avoided eye contact when I stepped onto the patio with my phone. They must have sensed it before I did. The fight was leaving my backyard and moving into offices with file numbers, inspectors, attorneys, and official stamps. And once that happened, confidence was not going to save them. The legal turn did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in my kitchen at 11:38 on a Thursday morning when an email from the county permit office landed in my inbox. For almost a week, I had been waiting for the official records. During that time, the developer acted like the truth was still negotiable. His crew had stopped digging directly in my yard, but the trench was still there, half covered with loose plywood and orange fencing. The mud had dried into hard ridges across the patio. My broken fence leaned in sections against the grass. Every time I looked outside, I saw the same message carved into my property. "We thought you would give up." The county email included several attachments: approved grading plan, approved site plan, stormwater management notes, construction access diagram, permit conditions, inspection checklist. I opened the site plan first, then I opened it again, because I thought I had missed something. The approved construction access route was not through my yard. It was not even close. The route entered from the service road behind the vacant lot, curved along the developer's own parcel, and stayed completely inside the marked limits of disturbance. The drainage work was also shown within the developer's property. The temporary pipe path on the county-approved drawing ran parallel to the rear boundary, not across my lawn, not beside my patio, and absolutely not through the middle of the backyard my wife had planted with her own hands. I zoomed in until the labels blurred. There was no temporary construction easement across my parcel, no homeowner access agreement, no attached authorization, no signature from me, no condition allowing the developer to remove my fence, no permission for equipment, pipe, workers, or material storage inside my property line. The permit did not support what they had done. It exposed it. A few minutes later, my attorney called after reviewing the same documents. Her voice was calm, but the meaning was sharp. The approved plans appeared to limit work to the developer's parcel. The survey confirmed the trench entered my land. The camera footage showed the crew removing my fence before I was awake. The HOA emails showed they had pressured residents with vague language, but never provided legal authority. Put together, it no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It looked like a private developer had changed the fieldwork without approval because my yard was more convenient than his own access route. That was the first part of the twist. The second part came from the HOA documents. Buried in the covenants was language about utility easements, but those rights belonged to recorded utility providers and the association only for maintenance of common elements. My backyard was not a common element. The townhouse project was not association maintenance. The developer was not repairing a shared utility line for existing homeowners. He was building a private project for profit. The HOA board could approve fence colors. It could send letters about weeds. It could hold hearings over trash cans and parking violations. But it could not sign away a homeowner's land to a developer because the developer wanted an easier route for machines. My attorney's demand letter made that painfully clear. It stated that no document produced by the HOA or the developer showed a valid easement, license, access agreement, or permit allowing entry onto my property. It demanded immediate restoration, preservation of all project communications, insurance information, and written confirmation that no further workers would enter my yard. It also warned the HOA that any attempt to fine me for damage caused by unauthorized construction would be treated as retaliation and evidence of bad faith. For the first time, the replies changed tone. The developer's representative stopped using phrases like community improvement and temporary inconvenience. The HOA management company stopped claiming everything had been approved. Instead, they began saying the situation was under review. They said they were gathering information. They said the board had relied on representations from the developer. That was a different kind of language. It was the language people use when they realize the paper trail is turning against them. Then the surveyor's final report arrived, signed, dated, and stamped. It confirmed the removed fence had been correctly placed along my boundary. It confirmed the trench crossed onto my property and extended approximately 18 feet inside my lot at its deepest point. It confirmed that the recorded easement at the rear corner did not match the area disturbed by the developer's crew. That single report destroyed the story they had been telling everyone. The developer had said I misunderstood my yard. The survey said I did not. The HOA had implied the area was available for utility access. The recorded documents said it was not. The supervisor had acted like the crew was following approved plans. The permit drawings showed they had left the approved route and entered private property. The camera footage added the final piece. It showed the workers arriving before sunrise, removing the fence with tools, and bringing equipment through the opening without knocking, calling, or waiting for any homeowner authorization. There was no emergency, no utility company truck, no county inspector, no one from the HOA standing there with documents. Just a construction crew quietly taking the path that saved them time. My attorney sent everything to the county permit office in one organized package. The subject line was simple: construction activity outside approved limits of disturbance. Inside were the permit number, parcel numbers, survey report, site plan comparison, photos, video stills, HOA notice, violation letter, and a written timeline. The message did not accuse anyone of evil intentions. It did not need to. The documents did the work. That afternoon, the county replied that an inspector would be assigned. I remember reading that sentence 3 times. For days, the developer had made me feel like I was alone in a fight against money, influence, and a board that wanted me quiet. But once the county accepted the complaint, the entire situation changed shape. It was no longer my word against his. It was his construction work against his approved permit. And permits do not care how confident someone sounds in a black SUV. That evening, I stood on the patio and looked across the torn-up yard. The trench was still ugly. The fence was still broken. The hydrangeas were still gone. Nothing had been repaired yet. But the power had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with shouting or revenge. It shifted because a stamped survey, a county plan, and a few minutes of camera footage had done what my anger never could. They proved he had never had permission to touch my land. The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning just after 9. I knew he was there before I saw him because the construction site changed sound. For weeks, that project had been nothing but engines, backup alarms, shouted instructions, metal buckets scraping dirt, and trucks grinding over gravel. But that morning, after a white county vehicle pulled up near the service road, everything seemed to slow down at once. One machine idled, then shut off. A worker lowered a pipe onto the ground and stepped away from it. The site supervisor walked quickly toward the front of the lot with his phone already in his hand. I stood on my patio with a folder under one arm and my phone in my pocket, recording only when necessary, because my attorney had told me not to perform anger for an audience. She said the inspector did not need drama. He needed facts. So I waited. The inspector introduced himself at my side gate. He was not loud, not emotional, not impressed by anyone's expensive SUV. He asked for my name, confirmed my address, and asked me to show him the area described in the complaint. I walked him through the yard slowly. I showed him where the fence had been removed. I showed him the trench line. I showed him where the pipe had been laid. I showed him the muddy runoff stains still visible along the patio. I showed him the broken sprinkler heads and the garden bed crushed under tire marks. Then I pointed to the survey flags still standing across the yard, bright and undeniable against the damaged grass. The developer appeared halfway through the walkthrough. He came through the opening in the fence with the site supervisor behind him, carrying the same confidence he had worn since the first morning, but it did not fit him as well anymore. He smiled at the inspector and immediately described the situation as a minor misunderstanding with an upset homeowner. He said the work was temporary. He said the HOA had been aware of the access. He said field conditions sometimes required small adjustments during construction. The inspector let him talk. Then he asked one question. Where is the approved plan showing work on this parcel? The developer paused. The site supervisor looked down at his clipboard. The inspector asked again, not louder, just clearer. He wanted to see the approved site plan, the construction access plan, and any easement or written authorization allowing equipment and drainage work inside my property line. That was the moment the whole performance started cracking. The developer said the documents were in the project file. The inspector said he had already reviewed the project file. The developer said the HOA had approved access. The inspector said the HOA was not the county permit office and could not expand the approved limits of disturbance. The supervisor said the trench was only temporary. The inspector said temporary work still required legal access and permit compliance. Nobody had a clean answer. The inspector walked the trench with the county plan on a tablet, comparing the approved drawings to the dirt under his boots. He looked at the survey flags. He looked at the fence opening. He looked at the drainage pipe. Then he stepped back toward the developer's parcel and measured the distance from the marked property line to the deepest point of the trench. He did not need to say much. His face said enough. A code enforcement officer arrived about 20 minutes later, then a stormwater compliance officer. Suddenly, the issue was no longer a homeowner complaining about a ruined backyard. It was a permitted construction project with possible work outside approved boundaries, possible drainage violations, possible unauthorized disturbance of private property, and possible misrepresentation of access. The developer tried to regain control by offering to discuss it privately. The inspector refused. He said all communication about the violation would be documented through the county office. He photographed the trench, the pipe, the fence, the tire marks, the runoff path, and the survey flags. He asked the site supervisor who instructed the crew to enter my yard. The supervisor said he would have to check. The inspector wrote that down. Then the sheriff's deputy arrived. This time, it did not feel like the first visit, when everyone had shrugged and called it civil. This deputy had the incident number from my earlier call, the survey report, and the county inspector standing beside the evidence. He did not arrest anyone, and I had not expected him to, but he took a formal trespass report, documented the removed fence, and noted that the county was investigating work outside the approved permit area. The developer was no longer smiling. His phone kept ringing. He walked away twice, speaking in a low voice near his SUV, while the site supervisor stayed behind looking like a man who had just realized the paperwork mattered more than the schedule. By noon, the inspector issued a stop work order on the affected portion of the project. He posted it where everyone could see it. The order stated that construction activity related to the disputed drainage and access work had to stop until the developer provided corrected plans, proof of legal access, erosion control measures, and approval from the county. No more digging. No more pipe installation. No more equipment crossing into my yard. No more pretending a private backyard was just a convenient construction route. The silence after that was strange. For the first time in weeks, there were no machines moving behind my house, no workers shouting, no supervisor waving people forward, just a bright notice posted at the edge of a project that had acted untouchable until someone with a badge and a file number asked for the documents. But the county was only half the problem. The HOA still had to answer for what it had done. My attorney sent the inspector's notice, the survey, and the stop work order to the HOA management company and demanded the violation against me be withdrawn immediately. She also demanded that the board preserve all emails, text messages, meeting notes, and communications with the developer regarding access to homeowner property. That phrase, preserve all communications, did something magical. The HOA stopped sounding confident overnight. The board president, who had once warned me about obstruction, suddenly wrote that the board never intended to authorize entry onto private property. The management company claimed the utility notice had been informational only. Another board member emailed residents saying there had been confusion about the scope of approved work, and that the issue was being reviewed by council. Confusion. That was the new word. Not progress. Not cooperation. Not community improvement. Confusion. A week later, the HOA held a public meeting, and I attended with my attorney sitting beside me. The room was fuller than usual. People came because they had seen the stop work notice. They had seen the county trucks. They had heard rumors that the townhouse project had been halted because of my backyard. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. A few looked like they already knew the developer had pushed too far because they had their own stories. When the board opened the floor, the president tried to keep things vague. She said there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding involving construction access near my property. She said the association was working with all parties toward an appropriate resolution. My attorney stood up and corrected the record without raising her voice. She stated that there was no recorded easement authorizing entry onto my parcel, The county-approved plans did not show construction access through my yard. A licensed survey confirmed the disturbed area was inside my property line. The county had issued a stop work order for work outside the approved permit scope. And the HOA had sent me a violation notice for conditions caused by the unauthorized construction. The room went quiet. Then another homeowner stood up. He said construction trucks had cracked the edge of his driveway, and the developer's office had ignored him. A woman from the next street said crews had blocked her mailbox 3 days in a row and laughed when she asked them to move. An older couple said runoff from the site had filled the drainage ditch behind their fence with mud. One by one, the polished story the developer had sold to the HOA began falling apart in public. The board president tried to move to the next agenda item. The room would not let her. Residents started asking who had approved the utility notice. They wanted to know whether the HOA had reviewed the actual permit. They wanted to know if the developer had donated to any neighborhood improvement fund. They wanted to know why the board had threatened a homeowner instead of asking for proof before letting a private company tear through someone's yard. The developer was not at that meeting. For the first time, he could not stand in front of people and control the room with charm. His absence made him look smaller than any argument could have. 2 days after the meeting, I received a formal letter from the HOA. The violation notice was withdrawn. The board stated that no fines would be assessed against me for the condition of the rear yard, while restoration and legal review were pending. They also admitted, carefully and without using the word apology, that the association had no independent authority to grant construction access over privately owned lots without proper legal documentation. It was not everything, but it was the first written crack in their wall. Meanwhile, the county required the developer to submit revised plans before work could resume. He had to show how drainage would be handled within his own property or provide a legally valid easement. He had to address erosion control failures. He had to explain why work shown on the approved plan had been performed elsewhere. And until those issues were resolved, the expensive machinery behind my house sat still. Every day it sat there, it cost him money. That was the part he had tried to make me fear. Delay, cost, liability, attorneys, paperwork. He had used those words like weapons when he thought they all pointed at me. Now they pointed back at him. One afternoon, I saw him standing near the posted stop work order, talking to someone in a suit. He looked over at my yard, and for the first time since this began, he did not look angry. He looked worried. Not because I had yelled, not because I had threatened him, because the county inspector had walked into my backyard, looked at the same dirt he had dismissed as temporary inconvenience, and turned it into an official violation record. That was when I understood the real power of evidence. It does not need to be loud. It just needs to be complete. The developer did not apologize first. People like him rarely do. The first thing that arrived was an email from his attorney, written in the cold language of risk management. It said the developer denied intentional wrongdoing, but in the interest of resolving a dispute efficiently, he was willing to coordinate restoration of the affected area. My attorney read it, almost laughed, and told me not to worry about the tone. The important part was not what he refused to admit. The important part was what he was suddenly willing to pay for. Within 2 weeks, his insurance company sent an adjuster to my house. This time, nobody called the damaged temporary dirt. The adjuster photographed the trench, the broken irrigation lines, the damaged patio edge, the missing fence section, the crushed garden beds, and the landscaping that had been destroyed. He measured the area, reviewed the survey, looked at the county notice, and asked for the original photos from before the work began. I had them. I had old pictures from summers when my wife was still alive, standing near the hydrangeas with pruning shears in one hand and dirt on her knees. I had photos of my daughter sitting under the maple tree with a popsicle. I had videos from quiet mornings when the yard was exactly what it had always been: small, ordinary, peaceful, and mine. Those pictures became part of the claim. The settlement did not bring everything back, but it forced them to restore what they could. The developer had to remove the temporary pipe from my property, fill the trench properly, regrade the lawn, repair the sprinkler system, replace the damaged fence, clean the patio, and hire a landscaping company approved by my attorney. They replaced the garden bed and replanted the hydrangeas, though I knew they were not the same ones my wife had planted. Some things cannot be restored with a check, but the check still mattered. The county also fined the developer for work outside the approved limits of disturbance and required him to submit revised plans before the affected part of the townhouse project could continue. That delay cost him far more than the restoration of my yard. Equipment sat unused. Contractors had to be rescheduled. Stormwater corrections had to be reviewed. The easy shortcut through my backyard became the most expensive route he could have chosen. The HOA tried to move on quietly. At first, the board sent a carefully worded letter saying my violation notice had been withdrawn and no fines would be assessed. Then, after several homeowners demanded answers, they admitted during a public meeting that the association had no authority to grant private construction access over individually owned lots without a recorded legal agreement. They did not say they were sorry in the way people say it when they mean it, but the president of the board lost her seat at the next election. For months, she had acted like the HOA was above ordinary homeowners. She had warned me about obstruction while standing beside the man who damaged my property. She had trusted the developer's promises more than a resident's rights. When election night came, people remembered. They remembered the stop work order. They remembered the violation letter. They remembered how quickly the board blamed a homeowner before asking for proof. She was replaced by a retired engineer who started his first meeting by saying, "No project, no contractor, and no developer would ever be allowed to use HOA language as a weapon against private property owners again." That felt like its own kind of repair. As for the developer, the townhouse project eventually continued, but not on his original schedule, and not with the same reputation. The county watched him closely after that. Every inspection took longer. Every plan revision was reviewed carefully. Every homeowner near the site knew to document everything. He still built his townhouses, but he no longer walked into our neighborhood like he owned more than the land he had actually bought. And my backyard slowly became quiet again. The new grass came in uneven at first. The fence looked too clean compared to the older sections. The young hydrangeas were smaller, thinner, and strange to look at for a while. But one morning, months later, I stepped outside with coffee and realized there were birds on the fence again. No engines, no shouting, no orange pipe, no mud sliding across the patio. Just a yard. My yard. I added one more camera facing the rear property line. I kept the survey report in a folder near my deed. I saved the county emails, the attorney letters, the insurance documents, and every photo, not because I wanted to live angry forever, but because peace is easier to enjoy when you know how to defend it. Sometimes people think property disputes are about dirt, fences, grass, or where a pipe was buried. They are not. They are about whether ordinary people are allowed to have boundaries when someone richer, louder, or better connected decides those boundaries are inconvenient. I did not win because I shouted louder than the developer. I did not win because the HOA suddenly became fair. I won because I stayed calm long enough to gather the truth. I saved the emails. I kept the videos. I read the bylaws. I checked the deed. I hired the surveyor. I called the county. I let the documents speak in rooms where arrogance finally stopped working. So if you ever find yourself in a fight like this, do not let anyone convince you that your property rights are just a technicality. Do not rely on verbal promises. Do not assume an HOA notice is the same thing as legal authority. Take pictures, save messages, ask for permits, check the survey, put everything in writing. And if this story helped you think differently about protecting your own home, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Leave a comment with what you would have done, save this story for later, and subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary homeowners who learned that the law can be quiet, slow, and frustrating, but when the evidence is strong enough, it can still make powerful people back up.